The wind moved like it had purpose that night, curling around the eaves of the old Walker homestead as if testing the bones of the house, pressing against the windows like a memory trying to return. Rain hit the panes in sharp angles. Inside, the hearth spat low flame, and Eloise sat with her mending, fingers calloused, lamp dimmed low to save oil. She hadn't spoken a word aloud all day. The quilt in her lap was patched too many times to count, but her needle moved as if it mattered. Something about fixing what had frayed made her feel less like something torn herself. Her shawl, heavy with damp from the earlier storm, clung to her shoulders. A kettle hissed behind her, the scent of rosemary and old broth barely disguising the musty chill of a house too long kept by one woman alone. Then came the knock. 3 times, slow, firm, unhurried. She didn't startle. She simply froze, the thread between her fingers held taut in mid-stitch. Another knock. She rose, quietly, not out of fear but caution carved from years of solitude. Folks didn't come to her door. Not anymore. And no one ever knocked in weather like this unless the need outweighed the shame. She opened it a crack. Rain sliced sideways in the wind. A man stood there, soaked to the bone, mud up to his knees, one arm tucked against his ribs like something was cracked underneath. His wide-brimmed hat dripped, shadowing a face too tired to beg and too proud to lie. One look and she knew he was no drifter. "I lost the wagon crossing Red Hollow." Or spooked. Will shattered. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Didn't mean to bother a lady this late." "You're bleeding," she said quietly. He gave a shrug that looked painful. "It'll stop." Eloise opened the door wider but only just. "I don't keep liquor. No doctor nearby. But there's fire. And stew." He hesitated, not at her words but her gaze. Then he nodded once, stepping in with care, dripping water and silence as he passed her. She watched him take in the room, wood walls, rough shelves, an old Bible by the window, but his eyes rested longest on the empty second chair at the table. She gestured to it, then to the fire. He sat by the hearth, removing his hat but not his coat. She saw then the blood staining his shirt at the side. Not deep, just enough to tell a story. "Name's Boaz," he said without looking up. "Eloise." It felt like a whisper in a cathedral. She returned to the kitchen, ladled stew into a chipped bowl, placed it in front of him without ceremony. He thanked her with a nod, then ate in a way that didn't rush, didn't presume, just enough to show he'd gone long enough without. When he finished, she handed him a cloth and a pan of warm water. He cleaned the wound himself. Didn't flinch, didn't ask for help. "How far were you headed?" she asked at last. "North of Dry Creek. Selling off a stretch of land nobody wants. Not much left there but stones and dead roots." Eloise looked at him a moment. "And you?" He met her eyes. "Same." She folded her hands in her lap, thumbs worrying each other. The silence stretched again, not uneasy, just unfamiliar. A stranger in her home, the scent of rain and pines still clinging to his coat. Yet there was something about the way he didn't fill the room with words. As if he knew how to let silence mean something. Outside the rain deepened. The wind picked up again, trying the windows with new insistence. "There's a pallet by the fire," she offered. "I won't take your bed." "I didn't offer it." For the first time he smiled, but it was faint, more in his eyes than his mouth. She fetched an old wool blanket from the cedar chest, laid it down beside the hearth and left him to it. When she returned with her mending, he was already lying down, one arm over his eyes, the other across his chest like a soldier at rest. "Thank you," he said softly. She didn't answer. Just sat down again in her corner chair and took up the needle. The storm would rage a while longer. So would the thoughts crowding her mind. But in that quiet cabin, something shifted. A thread pulled gently between two people who'd stopped hoping for company, yet hadn't fully given up on warmth. Sometime past midnight, she looked over. He was asleep, brow furrowed even in rest, as if his dreams had work left in them. She stared at the low flame, her hand still on the needle. The last man who'd slept by her fire had never left. By morning the wind would turn, and so would the world outside. But in that moment, there was only the sound of rain, the crack of wood settling, and a stranger, half-healed, half-trusted, sleeping beside the fire she'd kept lit all these years for no one. And for the first time in seasons, she didn't feel quite so alone. Morning rose not in gold but in hush. The storm had passed, but the air still held the smell of wet dust and pine sap. Mist clung low across the fields like breath not yet exhaled. Eloise stood on her porch with a tin cup of water, not sipping, just holding it, watching the world try to remember its shape after the rain. Boaz emerged from the cabin behind her, slow in his steps, a stiffness in his ribs from the fall. He didn't speak at first, only lifted his hat in a quiet gesture and looked out toward the road. The kind of man who, even after sleep, still carried the posture of trouble. "Thank you," he said finally. "For the fire. For the quiet." Eloise didn't answer right away. She nodded once. "You'll find your way?" He looked down the path, where the wagon had broken and vanished under last night's washout. "Somehow." Then, meeting her eyes again, "You sure you'll be all right?" She gave a small smile, thin, practiced. "I was all right yesterday. I'll be all right today." He tipped his hat and walked slow into the lifting fog, boots sucking softly in the mud, leaving behind nothing but steam and boot tracks. She watched until he disappeared past the ridge, her hands wrapped tight around the tin cup, though the water had gone warm. By mid-morning the town already knew. They always knew. Fern Tilly's kitchen window faced the road, and Fern had eyes sharper than her tongue. She'd seen the figure leaving Eloise's gate, hat low, coat dark, like a sin walking upright. And that was all it took. By the time the church bell chimed 10, the gossip had grown legs and galloped straight into the ear of Judge Whitlow. Sheriff didn't ride hard. He rode slow. Deputy Lem Pickens showed up first, knocking at Eloise's door with his hat in his hands and a kind of boyish shame in his eyes. "Miss Eloise," he said, twisting the brim. "Judge wants to see you." She wiped her hands on her apron and said nothing, just reached for her shawl. She knew better than to ask why. When a woman like her, alone, no kin, and history hanging around her neck like a bell, let a man inside her home during a storm, the town didn't ask questions. They passed sentence. At the courthouse, Judge Whitlow sat with his shoulders hunched forward like a man constantly waiting for the world to misbehave. His office smelled of old wood and sweat. He gestured to the chair before she was even fully inside. "Have a seat, Miss Walker." "I'd rather stand," she replied, voice steady. He adjusted his spectacles, looked over a slip of paper that was surely blank. "It's come to my attention," he said, as though it hadn't come to everyone's already, "that you harbored an unwed man overnight in your dwelling. You confirm that?" "I offered a stranger shelter in a storm. He was hurt." He tapped a knuckle on the desk. "This town holds standards. And while I understand storms and injuries, I also understand appearances. You were seen. He was seen leaving. You understand what that implies." Eloise felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from guilt but fury. She stared at the window, at the slow-moving clouds, counting her breath. "I offered kindness," she said. "Yes," Whitlow replied. "And now you'll offer restitution. Unless you wish for your name to carry further shame, there's a solution." He folded his hands. "The man Boaz McCrae. Rancher. Widowed. He will marry you." She blinked. 1,000 things pressed against her ribs, none of them words. "You think this justice?" she finally whispered. "I think it mercy," he said too quickly. "And if I refuse? You'll be labeled. You'll be watched. You'll be dismissed from the boarding votes and the church aid. It won't be my hand that does it, but I won't stop it." Lem Pickens shifted uncomfortably by the door but said nothing. Eloise turned her gaze to the floor. Her hands, rough from work, clenched at her sides. "What if he refuses? Then the blame falls square on you. It always did." She walked out without another word. The sun had broken through the clouds, lighting the muddy street in sharp contrast. She felt its heat on her face, but it did not warm her. Boaz McCrae stood by the dry goods store, talking low with the blacksmith. When he saw her, his brow furrowed. She approached slowly, every step scraping against the edge of pride. "They want us married," she said. He said nothing. She looked up at him. "To keep the town from tearing me apart." Still nothing. Finally he asked, "And you?" "I want the world to forget my name." He studied her then, quiet, jaw tense. "It's not a small thing." "I didn't ask for any of it," she replied. "Not the storm. Not your blood. Not their judgment." Boaz looked away, down the street where folks had started to gather in doorways, pretending not to watch. He exhaled hard. "You're asking me to be a fence," he said, "between you and what they throw. I'm asking you to be what you were last night. Quiet. Human." He nodded once, slow. "Then meet me by the judge's steps at sundown. I won't make you wait." She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She just turned and walked the long road back to her cabin. That afternoon the sun dried the puddles, but it could not dry her shame. Fern Tilly's curtains fluttered again. A boy laughed as he pointed at her from across the square. A woman pulled her daughter closer when Eloise passed the bakery window. But Eloise kept walking, head high, heart quiet. Back at home, she packed away the mending, swept the floor twice, then sat by the fire, waiting. As shadows lengthened across the floorboards and the orange of sunset curled through the cracks in the wall, she didn't cry. She didn't pray. She only thought of the stranger who had knocked in the rain, and wondered what it meant that he hadn't walked away. Outside, the bells rang 6. And this time, they were ringing for her. The sun had long since slipped behind the ridgeline, but its memory lingered in the dust that floated through the judge's parlor, glowing like old firelight. There were no guests, no music, no flowers. Just a lean wooden table that had once served as a writing desk, and a Bible set open between them like a tired witness. Eloise stood on the left, her shawl pulled tight, hands clasped low. Boaz stood on the right, one hand on the brim of his hat, the other still resting against his ribs out of habit. Judge Whitlow looked between them as if they were offenders of a quiet law, not participants in something sacred. He read from the book with a tone more suited to court fines than covenant. "Do you, Boaz McCrae, take this woman?" Boaz's voice was firm if dry. "I do." The judge turned. "Do you, Eloise Walker, take this man?" She answered before the words had fully formed. "Amen." The judge paused. His eyes flicked to her, then back to the page, but he said nothing. He closed the book. "So be it." No one clapped. No one kissed. Boaz nodded once, as if confirming a debt had been settled. Eloise's hands didn't move. The paper was signed in quiet strokes, the pen scratching like footsteps on gravel. Deputy Lem stood in the corner with his hat pressed to his chest, saying nothing, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. When it was done, they walked out together, side by side, not arm in arm, into the twilight of a town that had already written its version of the story. Doors opened just long enough for glances. Fern Tilly's silhouette stood like judgment behind her window lace. They didn't speak as they passed the schoolhouse, or the old cooper's shop, or the hollowed-out blacksmith's shed. Only when they reached the path beyond town did Boaz say softly, "I'll stay in the lean-to if you prefer." Eloise stopped walking. "No." He turned to her. "I didn't do this to live like I'm guilty," she said. "You'll stay by the fire. It's warmer there." He nodded, the lines around his mouth unreadable in the half-light. Back in the cabin, she lit the lantern low and set down 2 bowls of stew. They sat at the table, their movements careful but not awkward, like 2 people used to silence and shadows. Boaz ate slowly, his left hand trembling once when he reached for the salt. She noticed but didn't speak of it. After supper, he took his place again near the hearth. The same blanket, the same chair, now without the question of leaving. He unrolled his coat, leaned back against the wall, and exhaled. Eloise watched him a moment. "Why didn't you walk away?" He blinked slowly. "I've walked away from things before. This time felt like something I shouldn't." "That's not much of a reason." "No," he agreed. "But maybe it's enough." She said nothing, only stood and took her own seat near the window, her fingers once again worrying a piece of mending. Not for need, just something to hold. Night deepened. The fire crackled. Outside, an owl called once, then fell silent. The next morning, they moved around each other like early dancers, finding rhythm in unspoken steps. She fetched water. He gathered kindling. When she slipped while hauling the bucket, he caught her elbow, steadying her. Their eyes met. She nodded in thanks, and his hand let go slowly, as if he hadn't touched another soul in years. By the 3rd day, he'd fixed the door hinge without asking. She let him. By the 4th, she mended the lining of his coat. He didn't speak of it, but wore it the next morning with a small clearing of his throat that sounded suspiciously like gratitude. They weren't lovers. They weren't friends. They were something else, 2 shadows finding the shape of each other, not with light but with time. Boaz never asked about her past. But Eloise caught him one evening staring at the corner of the room where a locket hung by an old nail, dusty, unopened. She said, "That was my mother's." He looked away. "You take after her?" "No," she said. She was soft, gentle. "I came out like stone." Boaz's voice was quiet. "Stone holds up better in storms." They didn't touch. Not deliberately. But the nearness grew. She noticed how he took his tea now, 1 spoon of sugar, no milk. He noticed she always braided her hair before sleep, even when she thought no one was watching. The town, of course, kept its eyes on them. By the end of the week, Eloise was no longer greeted at the mercantile. Coins were left on the counter. No words. The Reverend's wife moved pews when she entered church. And the children, especially the girls, were kept away. Boaz saw it, and said nothing. Until one evening, as he mended a loose floorboard and she stirred beans in the pot, he asked, "You regret it?" She didn't turn. Regret's a heavy word. But does it sit with you? She paused, then stirred slower. It sat with me long before you did. Boaz put down the hammer. I can take my leave if that makes it easier. Eloise turned to him, finally. Her voice low but unwavering. What makes it easier is someone who doesn't ask me to explain myself. What makes it easier is having someone who doesn't need to be told not to hurt me. He looked at her like the sentence held something sacred. Then I'll stay. That night she brought him a second blanket. Their hands touched in the exchange. Neither pulled away. When she lay in bed, she heard him breathing by the hearth, steady, present. And though the fire was low and her body still cold beneath the quilts, something in her chest had gone warm. Not love. Not yet. But maybe the start of something that didn't need vows to be real. The wind changed on the 11th day. Snow arrived not with drama but with stillness, the kind that muffled even memory. It drifted down like ash over the prairie, turning fence posts ghost white and softening the world. Inside the cabin the fire cracked low. Eloise stirred it with the iron poker, watching embers glow like small rebellions in the dark. Boaz was outside mending the upper barn door. The latch had rotted, and every time the wind caught it, the wood groaned like it had something to confess. She told him not to bother, it wasn't his to fix, but he only said, I'm here. I may as well be useful. That was his way. Quiet usefulness. No declarations, no demands. He hadn't so much as touched her wrist again since that night he steadied her by the well. But every morning there was coffee brewed before she rose. Every evening her boots were scraped clean by the door. From the window she watched him now, coat dusted with snow, hat low, moving slow but sure. There was a steadiness to him she hadn't expected from a man with such sad eyes. She returned to the hearth, unfolded the letter she kept hidden behind the mantel clock. It was yellowed with age and folded 3 times. The ink had bled in the rain once. But the words were still legible. To Mr. Harlan Tate, this letter confirms transfer of property rights in exchange for Miss Eloise Walker, to be wed upon arrival. The girl is sound of limb with no known defects. I will not seek return. Her father's signature was still there, sharp as a knife wound. She folded it again, pressing it flat. Some things you didn't burn, no matter how much they begged for fire. Behind her, the door creaked open and Boaz stepped in, breath misting. His hands were raw from the cold, but his eyes were calm. Latch won't hold another winter, he said. Neither will that roof, she replied, nodding to the corner where snowmelt dripped onto the floor. He looked up, then offered the faintest smile. We'll patch it. She watched him remove his coat, hang it on the peg beside hers. That simple act, his things next to hers, felt more intimate than anything they'd shared yet. Later that evening, as the storm settled in, he surprised her. I never told you about her, he said, staring into the fire. My wife. Eloise didn't speak, only turned slightly in her chair to face him. Her name was Miriam. She died birthing our second son. The baby didn't live long either. That was 5 winters ago. He rubbed his palm like the memory lived there. I sold the land we meant to raise him on. Couldn't walk those fields without seeing her. Eloise's voice came out soft. Is that what brings you here? Running from ghosts? No, he said. They travel light. I carry mine. The silence between them thickened, not heavy but full. She rose, crossed the room and sat beside him, not touching, just near enough that her warmth might reach him if he wanted it to. She reached behind the mantel and handed him the folded letter. He read it once, then again. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look at her like a thing broken. He simply folded the letter once more and said, You were a girl. I was 17. Then it was theft, not shame. She blinked, eyes burning. No one had ever said it like that. They sat like that until the fire dimmed. The next morning brought sunlight sharp and clean, the kind that makes snow shimmer like something holy. But the town didn't see it that way. At the church steps, whispers turned louder. Fern Tilly had told someone who had told someone else, and now the talk was that the marriage wasn't real. That Boaz had never claimed her properly. That a woman like Eloise might have trapped him out of desperation. The word, annulment, was tossed around like a horseshoe, casually, cruelly. It came to a head when Reverend Pratt refused to let them take communion together. Said it might sow confusion among the flock. Boaz looked the Reverend in the eye and said nothing. Eloise turned and walked out. Back in town square, Judge Whitlow called for them again. You've not consummated the union, he stated flatly. And if the man does not defend your honor, Miss Walker, the town sees no reason to keep honoring a name you're borrowing. Eloise felt her stomach turn, but she kept her spine straight. Boaz's voice came low. You want proof of a marriage? The judge raised a brow. Words have power, Mr. McCrae. Silence has consequence. Boaz stepped forward, not to the judge but toward the gathered townsfolk behind him. Churchgoers, farmers, widows and gossips, people who once nodded to Eloise when her mother was still alive. He raised his voice, not loud but firm. A woman can offer a man food and fire and not owe him her body. She can open her door without selling her name. This town's full of folks who confuse mercy with invitation. A murmur rolled through the crowd. I married her, he continued. Not because I had to, but because she opened her door to me when no one else would. And if that shames you more than your own cruelty, then the shame ain't hers to carry. Eloise stood frozen. Not because of what he said, but because no man had ever spoken for her without trying to speak over her. Judge Whitlow narrowed his eyes. This isn't a court of sympathy, Mr. McCrae. Boaz stepped back. Then it's not a court I recognize. They returned to the cabin in silence. That night, she made stew again, though her hands trembled as she cut the potatoes. Boaz sat near the fire, staring at the same plank floor, hat on his knee. When she placed the bowl before him, he didn't lift his spoon. Just looked up and said, I meant it. I know. I'll sleep outside if you need room to breathe. I need you here, she said. And that was it. No kiss. No embrace. Just two people who knew that fire doesn't need to blaze to stay alive. She fell ill 2 nights later. Fever came swift, and by dawn her lips were cracked and dry, skin flushed with heat. Boaz stayed by her side, waking through the night to wipe her brow, spoon broth into her mouth, rub warmth back into her hands. He read to her from the Bible, not the fire and brimstone parts but psalms slow and low like lullabies for the weary. On the 3rd day she opened her eyes and found him asleep in the rocking chair, chin to chest, hands folded like a man in prayer. I'm still here, he whispered when he saw her watching. She tried to smile. Couldn't. So she reached for his hand instead. When she was strong enough to sit by the fire again, the storm had passed. Not the fever, but the one that hung over her heart. They sat together, close now, their arms brushing. Outside the world was still suspicious. But inside, here, they were learning something the town couldn't name. Not love, not yet. But something warm and rooted and willing to grow, even in frozen ground. When Boaz rose to stoke the fire, Eloise watched him with a new kind of ache. Not fear, not doubt, but something gentler. He turned. You all right? She nodded. Just thinking. About how some fires don't burn, she said. They just stay. He smiled. And this time she smiled back. The ground softened in March. It didn't ask permission. Snow receded like a curtain slowly being drawn, revealing brittle stalks, wagon ruts half filled with meltwater, and the long scars of winter left on fences and people alike. The prairie no longer groaned under the cold, it listened. Birds returned to the naked branches. Calves cried in distant fields. Even the air smelled like something new. But inside the Walker cabin the change was quieter. Eloise had recovered, though her body moved slower now, wrapped in a blanket more often than not. Boaz had begun building a new roof frame by hand, plank by plank, whistling under his breath like it was habit from another life. Neither of them spoke much of the past weeks. What had passed between them had not needed naming. It simply was. Like breath. Like firelight. They shared coffee now. Sat on the porch in the evenings when the sun dipped low and painted the world in rose and rust. She would knit. He would sand fence posts. Sometimes their knees would brush and neither would move. Sometimes she'd look up and find him already looking at her. It was for a brief time peace. Until the man in the black coat returned. He came riding just before dusk, the hooves of his horse soaked to the knees in red mud, his silhouette a dark smear against the horizon. Eloise saw him first, standing at the sink, wiping her hands on a cloth, when she caught sight of a rider crossing the east ridge. She went still. Boaz stepped beside her, following her gaze. His jaw tightened. You know him? She nodded slowly. His name's Harlan Tate. Your father's deal. Yes. She didn't say more. She didn't have to. The rider slowed as he neared the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the new roof frame, the stacked firewood, the man standing beside her. Then he dismounted, not bothering to tie the reins. You've done well for yourself, Eloise, he said. His voice was dry like cracked tobacco. He removed his gloves with deliberate care. I came to collect. Boaz stepped forward, body angled between them. This land's hers. You've no claim here. Tate's lip curled. I've got paper says otherwise. A deal made years ago. This girl was promised to me. Now I hear she's married, fraudulently without proper witness or priest. That makes her mine again. I'm not a mule, Eloise said. No, Tate replied. But you were bought. Don't matter if the horse got sick on the way, deal still holds. Boaz stepped down from the porch. You need to leave. I'll leave with her, Tate said, pulling the paper from his coat. You want to fight? You'll get it. Eloise came down the steps, wind catching her shawl. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut through the dusk like flint against steel. You want to hold a girl to a contract her father made with whiskey on his breath? You want to drag me back to a past you think I still belong to? Tate didn't answer. She reached out and took the letter from his hand. Held it up. This contract sold a girl. But I am a woman now. And that man you see beside me, he didn't buy me. He stood beside me when your kind tried to make me disappear. He stayed when I was sick. He watched over me without ever asking for more than a name. Can you say the same? The crowd was already forming at the edge of the road, townsfolk drawn by the sound of argument, the scent of something scandalous. Judge Whitlow was there and Fern Tilly and half the church board. Tate sneered. That's a nice story, but this paper holds up in court. Boaz took a step forward. So does fire. He struck a match. Held it up. Waited. Eloise said nothing. She took the match from Boaz's fingers, set it to the edge of the paper, and watched as the flame took. The contract curled in her hands like a dying leaf, turning to ash that scattered on the wind. The town gasped. Judge Whitlow started to speak, but Eloise lifted her hand. I've had enough of being quiet so other people can sleep easier. If any of you still think I'm the girl who needed saving, you're wrong. I didn't marry Boaz to escape my past. I married him because he never asked me to be anyone but myself. A long silence followed. Then someone clapped. Just once. Then again. Deputy Lem, eyes wide, began nodding, and a few others followed. Even Fern Tilly looked away, folding her arms, her mouth pressed thin but silent. Harlan Tate said nothing. He gathered the reins, mounted his horse, and rode away without another word. That night, Eloise lit a second lamp. She laid out plates for supper without asking. Boaz came in quietly, washed his hands at the basin, then sat beside her. His eyes searched hers, but he didn't speak. You're still here, she said softly. I told you, he replied. I stay. She reached across the table and took his hand. No ceremony. No applause. Just the still warmth of something earned. Spring came fully a week later. The fields turned green at the edges, like memory trying to forgive itself. They built a new fence that month. The posts went in straight. The gate creaked less than before. On Sundays, Eloise returned to church. People didn't speak, but they didn't turn away. Boaz walked beside her. No one questioned it. On the porch one evening, Eloise leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "It was never about saving me." "I know." She paused. "It was about letting me be seen." "I saw you the first night," he said. "Even when you didn't." They watched the prairie grow gold with sunset, the sky soft with promise. And in that hush, between dusk and dark, something in her settled. Not because life had made sense, but because it had made room. Some stories don't end in kisses or confessions. Some end in silence shared between two people who chose to stay. And in this world, that's more than enough. If you've ever been written off, misjudged, or quietly endured more than they'll ever know, remember this. Sometimes, survival looks like a woman standing tall with ash in her palm. Sometimes, love speaks loudest when it says nothing at all. And sometimes, the fire they thought would burn you down becomes the light you build a home by. Stay soft. Stay standing. And let them wonder how you survived.